Hey everyone, I am joined by Scott Wasson, who is now in the RTG group at AMD, working on Radeon. Scott, how's it going?
Pretty good. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so Scott is, if you don't know, former editor-in-chief at Tech Report, now works at AMD. Scott's got a pretty big legacy, I suppose, with things like frame time testing. That was one of the big things Scott really drove early on and that we use now. And so we're here today to answer a couple reader questions, maybe one. We'll see how long it goes. Before that, this coverage is brought to you by the Computex Conference, which runs from May 30th to June 3rd in Taipei, Taiwan this year. Computex is the biggest event of the year for PC hardware and technology, where we preview the newest prototypes before they come to market. We highly recommend attending or following this event online for industry professionals and enthusiasts. Learn more at the link in the description below. The one I had was from Street Guru in the Discord chat. And that was, he's been asking this for months now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's an interesting one. So Street Guru said, can you elaborate on GPU, quote, IPC, about how an RX 480 at roughly 1400 megahertz and a 1060 at roughly 2000 megahertz can get pretty close scores across games? Is there anything specific in GCN that lets it do more work with lower clock speeds? So if you follow that question,
right,
I think it's a pretty interesting one. What are your thoughts? So
this is complicated. Maybe we should start with the instructions per clock one, and this portion of it would apply to CPUs as well as graphics chips, and then we can talk about specifically what happens like in an RX 480 versus a 1060. So the first bit of it is there's a sort of an interesting thing that happens when you're designing a big chip like this, a processor. There's some trade-offs that engineers make. There are all kinds of trade-offs to make, but one of the big ones is basically how much work can you do in a clock cycle, and how much clock speed can you achieve at a given voltage, which is going to determine your power use, and things like that. And also, there's just a question of overall architectural efficiency because of how you're trading off amongst these things. So there are a few things that you can do. One of them is break the work, as he said, into pipeline stages. So you know that you need to do a certain amount of work to get through, processing a certain, piece of things. And you can choose, and architects do this, to break the work into smaller chunks, or more smaller chunks, or even more smaller chunks, right? And the thing that you get when you decide to lengthen your pipeline and make more stages and break the work up is the possibility of being able to run at higher clocks. The reason for that kind of comes down to this question of when you have a whole bunch of gates or transistors flipping inside of a chip, they're going to use a certain amount. They need a certain amount of voltage to do that. They're going to use a certain amount of power, and when you have a really heavy amount of work going at each stage, that's going to limit sometimes the clock speed that you can do that work at. Right? So the more stages you break it into, the more that you can potentially go ahead and crank the clock up. But then you're doing less work in each cycle, right?
Right.
So
well, we should also say, just kind of a primer, when we're talking about things like pipeline stages, what are examples of things that happen in pipeline stages? Or what is an example of a stage in a GPU pipeline?
Right. So
with CPUs, we've got things like adds and multiplies and stuff like that.
So a GPU in its shader core is very much like a CPU. They're both processors. They both break things into different stages in the pipeline for different bits of work that they're going to do. So things like adding and things like that. So that's fundamentally similar. CPUs often will have longer pipelines and be designed for higher frequencies. The other thing you get in a GPU is there is hardware that's graphic-specific custom hardware to handle certain things like texture filtering and things like that. So there's some other hardware in a GPU that's custom that you don't have in a CPU. But fundamentally, they're about the same in that regard.
Sure. So then on the sort of IPC question, there's pipeline stages. You said it's complicated though, so what other types of variables do we have when looking at the frequency versus performance between architectures?
Well, different architectures are tuned for different frequencies. And usually the trade-off is straightforward. You're going to have a longer pipeline and do less work at each stage in order to achieve a higher clock. But then, you have to make sure that that's a good trade-off, right? At each stage, there's actually some efficiency that you could get out of a longer pipeline in the sense of being able to run at lower voltages, because each stage only needs less voltage, right? But to get to higher clock speeds, as any overclocker knows, you want to turn the voltage up. That can be problematic because power use is determined mainly by voltage. It's voltage squared is in the little equation, along with the clock frequency and the number of transistor cycling. And so turning up the voltage can be a bad thing. And there's some kind of famous examples in CPU architecture of things not going well when you break the work into a lot of stages and pursue lots of clock speed, and you turn up the voltage and get a lot of, especially leakage power. The most famous one was when Intel went from
Pentium 4 era, right?
Pentium 4 Northwood to Pentium 4 Prescott. They had a 20-stage pipeline that ran at 2 gigahertz and did pretty well.
Did they go to like 50 or something?
And they went to 31 stages, I believe. I was reviewing them at the time with the Prescott. And they went to a 90 nanometer process, and very famously, the power use was pretty high on that product. And the performance was not what they wanted, because I don't think they hit the clock speeds that they were hoping to hit. It turned out that voltage squared term in that equation took over before they got where they wanted to go, right? And so that's an example of trying to make a trade-off architecturally and not really getting where you want to go. So you have to be careful when you pursue clock speed, because you can wind up in a situation where, you've gone too far and the power runs out of control. The other side of that, in some ways, is like newer Intel CPUs, and now with Ryzen, you have the same thing. You're pursuing more instructions per clock so that you can be a little more conservative on your clock speed and still get lots of work done. Right. But at the same time, AMD's running at 4 gigahertz now. Intel's running in similar ranges. So there's a trade-off that's been made there. GPUs tend to choose a little bit lower clock speeds, right? Yet there is a difference between, right now, the clock speeds you'll see in the latest NVIDIA stuff and what you'll see in the latest Radeons. Yet, as he mentioned, you see similar performance. Why is that?
Yeah, and it's an interesting challenge for you or NVIDIA, because I feel, I don't know how much of a problem this is, because we're so in the fairly technical bubble that we don't really engage with general consumers too much. But if you have two products on Newegg and you're just looking at the specs and you see this one's at 1200 megahertz and this one's at 1800 megahertz or whatever, like, does that pose a marketing challenge as well?
Potentially. GPUs, though, are interesting because graphics is sort of this traditional, they call it embarrassingly parallel problem, where you can do lots of work in parallel to get pixels drawn and shaded and all of that, and it works out very well. And so the relevant difference between an RX 480 and a GTX 1060 really does come down to how wide your GPU is. And one of the best measures of that is what you would call, we call them shader processors, stream processors. NVIDIA calls them CUDA cores. They're really just lanes in a vector ALU, right? How many do you have? And I think with the GTX 1060, they have like 1,280.
I think so, yeah.
And with the RX 480, I think we have a 2,306, I believe. I wrote that down. We have a much wider GPU than they do. So they're running at a higher clock speed, but we got the lower clocks, a little more conservative. You can tune that way, and then have the wider machine. And so if you look at the number of like peak floating point operations per second that an RX 480 can do versus a 1060, that will come out, I think, actually in our favor.
It does.
If you look at...
It's about 5 point something versus 4 point something.
Right, and then there's the texture filtering hardware, which is built in there next to the shader core and all that. You look at that, we look really nice on that comparison as well. You look at game performance, we can come out looking good there. The other thing that's interesting between the 480 and the 1060 is they have a 192-bit memory interface at 8 gigabit per second. We have a 256-bit memory interface at 8 gigabit per second. So we actually have a nice increase in memory bandwidth over there. Now, credit to them, they've been able to get some pretty good performance out of lighter weight hardware. But when you buy the Radeon, you're actually getting a little bit heavier weight hardware. And one of the results of that, and you'll see this, is over time in our products, they tend to age well. They tend to perform well in newer games as workloads change, because they simply bring more power to the table. Right? And so it can be a very good value to have a GPU that, even though it has a lower clock, is actually wider and providing you, heavier hardware overall.
So you've got power considerations with voltage and pipeline stages, and then you have just kind of the width of the machine in general, so to speak. Are there any other major factors there we should go over?
Well, we talked about memory bandwidth.
Right.
Right. We talked about the custom graphics hardware as well. There are a number of, in a GPU, there are a number of constraints that you have. And so you can really evaluate the potential, not necessarily delivered performance, but the potential of the GPU by looking at things like, polygon throughput capability in the setup in the front end, shader flops, texture processing capability, render backend pixel fill rate, which also affects anti-aliasing blending. There are a number of key things like that you could look at. And those are better to look at in totality, I think, than just clock speed.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah, it's a complicated equation. And that's why, like we were sort of saying, you have a 1060 and a 480 are fairly well matched in actual gaming performance. So there's obviously a lot more than just they run at a higher clock or we have more cores or something like that, which we sort of talked about in AskGN recently. But other than that, so what about, maybe this is perhaps a better question for Raja, but on the cost side of the equation, is there a significant difference if you are going for a higher core count with a lower clock rate versus the opposite? Is there a physical manufacturing cost to add the extra cores and just run at a higher?
So that's actually complicated too,
right.
but straightforwardly, I think you would say that, say you build a pipeline that has more stages, you've got to dedicate more transistors to those stages. So each individual core is going to take more transistors than one that might run at a lower frequency, as I understand it.
Sure.
And now, there are all kinds of other architectural differences and things like that come into play. And at the end of the day, you get out something that sort of is like, you have a certain die size on your chip, it's manufactured at a certain process, so it costs a certain amount to make.
Right.
All of these trade-offs feed into that bottom line, but it's not always a straightforward kind of thing, right?
Sure.
So it's hard to answer specifically, but I don't think that it's as simple as smaller, slower frequency better, or larger, higher frequency better.
Right. Let's tackle one more here, or well, maybe two. We'll see what kind of time we're looking at. So I've got one from CypherXV, also on Discord, who asked a question for Scott. When it comes to game optimization with GPUs, is there any real communication with developers before you release the GPU, or does AMD make the changes through driver updates? I suppose optimization changes would be the question. And brings up an example of Ryzen as a new architecture with developers. You want them to have earlier access so that they can start planning ahead. So on the GPU side, what's that look like?
Actually, we have a whole team of folks who deal with the software the game makers, right? And it's everything from business relationships to dev tech guys who are working with the engine and game developers, to optimize their stuff. And there's some really, really smart engineers at AMD who I've met since I started working there a little over a year ago, who do that work. And they go out in some cases and will even go and sit in the offices of a game developer for a while and just contribute their efforts to make sure that it runs well on Radeon.
Right.
And many of the same people who are doing that kind of stuff are now being involved in some of the Ryzen stuff as well, to make sure that we're going and working with game developers to get the right things done so that our games run well. And you saw the improvements in like Ashes as Singularity.
Right, Total War as well.
Right, and that's a result of the efforts of those folks. So there are real people, many of them, who go and do that kind of thing.
It's not just magic, right?
It's not just magic, and I know that people are kind of impatient. They want to see Ryzen come out of the gate and everything's already optimized for it.
Right.
But it's a very new architecture. It's a new platform. It's got more threads to try to deal with, and multi-threaded programming is a non-trivial thing to do.
Developers have a lot of ground to make up there too.
Right, and low-level APIs are still a relatively new thing that developers are getting their heads around. Game engines are incorporating support for, but it takes time. So all of this stuff will continue to take time. But I tell you, I've met the people. I've talked to them. There's some really bright folks, really dedicated people who go and do this work. Yeah.
Does so when working at least on the GPU optimization side, just because that's where you work, on the GPU side, does a lot of this stuff, the collaborating with developers, happen at more of an engine level, i.e. the Epic Games or Crytek's or Amazon Lumberyard, I suppose, Unity? Does it happen more at that level, or do you sort of look at individual games and studios and help with those titles?
It's both. It's a little both.
Right.
We actually have dedicated teams. In fact, we hired a really bright guy named Frank Vitz, who is coming in and doing doing our Unreal Engine efforts, right? And we had to work with Epic, who they then feed into a whole bunch of game developers who use Unreal Engine in their games. At the same time, the individual shaders and implementations of a lot of things in games are going to be custom.
Right.
And so we also need to work with the developers of the individual games to make sure their particular application runs well on Radeon. So it's both.
And Frank Vitz, formerly Crytek, right?
Yeah.
We interviewed him previously. It's still on the channel if anyone's interested on CryEngine. And from memory, I think we spoke with him about VR and about DX12, which was a really hot topic that year at GDC, and still is, because as you mentioned, DX12 and Vulkan, Doom is kind of the seminal example, and then after that it's like people have to learn how to use it. It's not necessarily trivial to use the low-level APIs.
No, it's not. But there's a lot of goodness there.
Right. Let's do one more. We don't have to go too crazy in depth on this one because one, we've covered it on our site and channel a few times, and two, you wrote the book on it. Somewhat literally with Inside the Second, the article on Tech Report, if anyone wants to read that. So the question came through Twitter, and it was, this is regarding our metrics. What in the world is 1% low or 0.1% low? Can't we use a simple graph like average, minimum, and maximum? And so like I said, we've both, on the media side, explained this a bit. But it's worth kind of revisiting just with the Vega's around the corner, new RX cards are here. We're looking at Ryzen. All of these things have all of the frame time metrics written all over them for testing.
Yeah.
So let me get your perspective as someone who more or less was on the pioneering side of this. Minimums, maximums, and averages. I've got my thoughts on it, but I'm going to let you open. So when we're looking at those...
Yeah, it's a big topic, right? And I think what he says when he means when he says minimum, maximum, average is frames per second.
Right.
Which is what everybody has used for years as the metric for gaming performance. And I tested video cards, graphics, CPUs for many years and would report results in FPS.
Right.
And I kind of had this nagging thing in the back of my head, like, is this the whole thing? And I actually was at dinner with this guy from Thermaltake, and he was like, Scott, you tell me, if I'm getting 30 frames per second out of a game, why isn't that just enough?
Right.
Why shouldn't I care? Because a movie at 24 frames per second is pretty smooth, right? So why do I need more? And there are all these arguments about human perception and things like that. But at the end of the day, the bigger question underneath the surface of that was realizing that 30 FPS is an average over a relatively long span of time. And even things where they're tracking frame, like FPS over time, people have been doing it in 1 second windows. Well, a lot can happen inside of a second, right? You can have a 30 FPS result that is a whole bunch of 33 millisecond frames that's nice and smooth and feels reasonably good. You can also have a 30 FPS result that's a whole bunch of really fast frames, 16 milliseconds or less, and then you can have a 200, 300, 400, 500 millisecond single frame where it just hitches, right? I actually saw this. I was testing Battlefield Bad Company, and there was I had a test scenario of a certain area where I would walk through, and some cards that would be smooth, other cards that would just be janky.
Right.
But in the FPS results, they were the same. And the minimum FPS results really didn't show it. And it turned out that at the end of the day, FPS averaged over a large time or over even 1 second windows is a very low resolution timer.
Right.
It cannot tell you whether your animation was smooth when you average over that span of time. So you need to look at the individual frame times. And you can convert that back to FPS like you guys do. But at the end of the day, you need to be looking at this sort of entire distribution of frame times to understand, was my performance sufficient to provide smooth animation over this whole span? And the answer turns out to be very different in some cases where the FPS looks the same.
Right. Yeah, and an average, so that we know problems with minimum and maximum, especially minimum, where we've even shown this in some of our results on the site. You might have minimum is one number out of potentially thousands. So taking a percentile is kind of preferable to that. Maximum is also not great because it doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Averages, though, are not perfect either.
Right.
Right? They're a bit misleading for the reasons you're saying.
Right. They kind of show you potential, but they don't show you delivered smooth animation.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And that can lead into a topic we'll have for a separate video on interpreting VR benchmark data. So check back for that. But that's it for this one. We'll have at least one more video with Scott. And Scott, thank you for joining me.
Certainly.
We'll see you all next time.